All right, world, we are back for another Facebook Live. I'm Sam Lichtenstein, one of your directors of analysis, here with Carmen Colosi, our Latin America analyst. Carmen, how is it going?
Going good. We're here today to discuss a very interesting discussion, which is the Colombian peace negotiations.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that I know you've been covering very highly, but to be honest, I feel like most of the media attention has not been there. I mean, obviously, you have pressing priorities like the war in Ukraine, but this is actually, from our perspective, a really huge story. Can you kind of set the scene? Like, what are we dealing with at the moment?
Definitely. So this comes as we are having the somewhat new administration of Gustavo Petro come into Colombia. He's a leftist, one of the first Colombian leftist presidents that we've seen in recent history. Don't mind the siren behind me. This is live, everybody. But we
It
have
has nothing to do with the peace process in Colombia.
nothing to do with that process. What's really interesting here about the peace process is that Petro is really pushing for this thing which he has hallmarked as paz total, or in English, total peace. And that push is really an effort to have negotiations with as many of Colombia's armed groups as possible. So Colombia has, I would say, around five major armed groups, guerrilla groups, or even in one case, just a cartel that operate within the country. And that's something that has been really significantly disruptive to the country's security, sector, to business operations within the country, and we've really overall seen the presence of armed groups in Colombia be a significant detriment to Colombia's ability to grow and prosper, even on a societal level. And so when we're looking at where to go forward, Petro is really trying to maneuver a very difficult maze here, which is how to negotiate with a variety of different armed groups at once.
Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, unfortunately, when we certainly in the United States, but I think in a lot of parts of the world, think of Colombia, you of course associate it with this massive, violence that we of course saw seriously in, the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. That's thankfully tapered off significantly in recent years, and part of it's because of a prior peace process with the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. I mean, we don't need to go too far down that rabbit hole, but suffice to say, there was an agreement, there's been a lot of process, but it also, in the wake of that agreement in 2016, exposed a lot of challenges that are kind of informing how we're looking at these current negotiations. So I know you've been doing a lot of research, Carmen, and have a forthcoming piece that we'll be publishing about some of the risks ahead for these processes. So give us kind of the sense of what are Petro's government confronting as they try to figure out how to negotiate with this kind of constellation of groups.
Sure. So a few of the issues that we're seeing is, especially as, there's a variety of different groups. The Petro government is really approaching it as, okay, we're going to have one general peace accord, and then we're going to try to get as many armed groups onto the accord as possible. Now, this can be very tricky, especially as, different groups might have different demands of the Petro government, and we could definitely see that be something that the Petro government could potentially give as an overwhelming amount of concessions to the armed groups, something that could be potentially somewhat politically unpopular. You have to remember that in Colombia, many of the citizens grew up experiencing a significant amount of insecurity due to the armed groups. So there is a political element there as well. So that's one of the things that we're really seeing. Another one is that the any sort of peace accord needs to be agreed upon from the point of view of the armed groups. Now, Sam, I know that you do a lot of coverage in the Middle East and in different parts of the world, and we really see a somewhat similarity in Colombia's armed groups and how they're structured. They have this very cell-like structure, and that leads to a variety of disparate factions within a single armed group. And we could have some factions that agree with the efforts towards peace, and some that don't. So we have seen in Colombia historically that some factions are willing to in some ways sabotage peace agreements between other factions in the government.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously saw that in the case of the FARC demobilization. You still have thousands of people that were part of the FARC when it was technically an organization that are now, I guess we would call as kind of dissident members, part of this constellation of
Yeah.
groups. They reject what the overall FARC did. And even in this new round of negotiations, we've already seen that from certain groups like the National Liberation Army, which is, I guess, probably by most estimates, the largest remaining group in the country, where you have some leaders that suggest they're negotiating. You have some factions that have still been doing operations throughout the country, and what the proverbial left hand and right hand are doing is not always in sync.
Completely. And that's something that the Petro government is really having to walk a very, tight rope here when it comes to these negotiations, because on one hand, the citizens and the public are seeing that the ELN and other armed groups are continuing activities and they're very unhappy about that. But on the other hand, the government is still pushing for peace accords and has to balance reacting to different, events within the armed groups while also maintaining the peace accords in a negotiation phase. So that's a very difficult, ledge to walk for the Petro government.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me draw that out because I think the political challenge here is super interesting. Definitely not a position I envy because obviously you at some point, let's say you get an agreement with all these groups or at least some of them, you still need to figure out how that's going to pass muster with the population and the government. And what we saw in 2016 when the government did this with the FARC was ironically the people actually rejected the deal. The government kind of said, well, we're just going to ignore that. We're going to put it before Congress. And Congress eventually approved it. But that's obviously a very contentious issue. So how does Petro think about navigating this potential end state where there is an agreement? Do we have an idea of what his plans are to put it to a vote?
So I think Petra is currently kind of relying on, the idea that it will pass through Congress. I think he, definitely learned that earlier lesson from the 2016 peace agreement, which is that, it's more likely to be passed through Congress. Currently, Petro has a very, I would say, fragile coalition within Congress. Some of the other parties that are part of his coalition are, not ideologically aligned, but have been voting with his Pacto Histórico coalition thus far. But we could see this very fragile coalition break down, and so if that happens, we could see a significant that be a threat or an inhibitor to a peace agreement going through.
All right. So then just to kind of bring this back to all of our listeners, Carmen, this is an interesting topic for sure. And we care about it because we're geopolitical nerds. This is what we like to talk about. But this does have real practical consequences for the country, right? Because even though we're, of course, very blessedly not in this state that we were for a few decades of, bombings almost every day in major urban centers, there's still a lot of violence. There's still a lot of economic repercussions from this. So when we're looking at the business environment or political stability, all of these kind of things that organizations think about when they're operating in a country like Colombia, what is the potential and what are the pitfalls that they need to be considering as they evaluate the state of these negotiations?
Definitely. When we're looking at Colombia's overall security climate, the presence of the armed groups have been, significantly disruptive to things like supply chains in the country, to oil and gas activities, as armed groups like to tap into pipelines, and just generally disruptive to any sort of personnel that are operating on the ground in the country. And so, as we are thinking of the peace negotiations, a lot of these negotiations are predicated on the fact that there are some sort of mutual agreement to lay down arms between the government and the armed groups. And so what that means is that we're likely to see a period of time in which there's going to be somewhat of a decreased security threat in Colombia as the negotiations are ongoing. And that can be significantly beneficial to any sort of company or person that is even just traveling in Colombia. But on the longer scale, I think our concern here at RANE is that if the negotiations do fall apart, we could see that happen, very quickly, and we could see violence escalate very quickly as well. And just more broadly, even if we do see negotiations go through, there's a significant amount of armed groups, tying themselves to a peace accord. We could potentially see that kind of leave a power vacuum for other smaller groups to, try to take a hold of certain territory. And that could lead to, a worsening security climate in Colombia.
All right, well, you just laid out a lot there that's interesting, Carmen. And obviously, all of the people that are watching right now can read all of your analysis on this issue, with all the other Latin America topics you're following by visiting us at our website. And with that, I want to say I think we're both in short sleeves today, signifying it's definitely spring finally here in New York. So hope that you can enjoy the nice weather this weekend.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for having this conversation, Sam.
Thanks for being with me.